Today is Canada Day. I'm sure that this is a day that most people in the United States actually don't even acknowledge or understand. But it goes back to 1867 when three separate colonies were brought into one. And actually, Canada itself wasn't really truly independent until about 1982. Now, this is maybe shocking to many. And when I say independent, meaning that their parliament would no longer have to answer to anything from parliament in the United Kingdom. And here, so this is, July 1st right now, 2018. We're just a few days away from what we celebrate in the United States as the Day of Declaration of Independence. Now, I want to talk about this, but I want to start off with a joke that I heard about Canadians once, by a Canadian. I might have it a little bit off, but I think I mainly have it right. How do you get 40 Canadians to get out of a pool? You ask them to get out of the pool. Now, what's the joke? The joke is that in Canada, not only is there something to be celebrated about politeness, but also complying with laws. I wouldn't say that it's like a blind, when I've been in Canada, I didn't get the impression by anybody that they had this idea that they should just quickly obey authority with no question. But it's a different political culture that developed in Canada compared to us. Canada is what the United States would look like without a violent revolution. One could make a joke, how do you get 40 Americans out of a pool? The answer would be arrest one of them and the other 39 will come out. In other words, we kind of almost pride ourselves on not listening to authority, especially when we think it's not fair, right? But we don't really have a consistent way of dealing with this. And this, I think, is a kind of an interesting thing to reflect upon during these really tumultuous times in the United States. Because every country that is born out of a revolution has a dilemma that a country like Canada doesn't. A violent revolution will eternally haunt the state that it emerges from. Because a revolution really sends this message, it's very loud and clear, that ethics are superior to the state and laws. But we have a society where not everybody always has the same ethics, right? And ultimately, it's the state that has the police force and the military that can assert whatever it wants. And so you kind of have this tension there. I mean, but I want you to even just ponder this. The Declaration of Independence wasn't when we became independent. And everyone who signed the Declaration of Independence was committing an act of treason. A revolution is the most extreme act of illegality. You are an outlaw. You're treasonous. And that's how history would have recorded it had we not won, right? I mean, if a governor of California would write a Declaration of Independence separate of the United States and said that we are expelling the federal troops, that's an act of treason according to the law, right? It's the same thing that was happening back then. And so this tension there, right? Okay, so it's like you're breaking laws and then you're going to reinstitute laws as you become a state. So how did the founding fathers themselves then approach this topic? It's interesting. Shortly, not long after the War of Independence was won, many of the revolutionary soldiers, men who fought gave, they gave their all to make the colonies independent. Many would come back to their farms, and they couldn't afford to make payments on time because they just spent all their time fighting a war, and the economy was really struggling. Well, those really loyal, rich merchants in the east of Boston said, hey, a deal's a deal. You owe us money. And what did they do? We used to have laws that if you don't pay what you owe, you go to debtor's prison. And you literally had American war vets rotting, dying in these open air debtor's prisons because they couldn't afford to pay after they gave their all to secure the interests of those greedy merchants in Boston. So a man named Daniel Shays, who was sick of this, also a farmer vet, led a rebellion. And what did the establishment do? How did some of our founding fathers react to this? This is what Samuel Adams had to say regarding this rebellion. He said, in monarchies, the crime of treason and rebellion may admit of being pardoned or lightly punished, but the man who dares rebel against the laws of the republic ought to suffer death. And so that was his take on things now. So all of a sudden, in a republic, can't question laws. Now, Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, wrote in a letter to James Madison that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. And here's the point: what I wanted to to talk about this is that our founding fathers had a wide range of views on many things. There was not this monolithic view about so many different aspects of what would be considered good or bad in American life. Now, the other aspect of our legacy of the Declaration and then the winning of the Revolution is that during this whole time, it wasn't about liberty and freedom for everybody that was here. We know this, but it was observed even back then. There was a British intellect, Samuel Johnson. He said, observing what was going on here, how is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of the Negroes? What he's saying is, here these men have slaves, and then they're trying to justify a violent revolution against the mother country based on having liberty? Give me a break. This was how it was being observed by some. Now, we know from the founding fathers that some were against slavery. Thomas Jefferson actually kept slaves all the way up until his death, and didn't even provide freedom for them after he died. So we had that aspect that we had to resolve in our country, and we know that didn't end until we had a civil war. The other legacy we've had to deal with is, and the same goes for Canada actually, is that we're a nation built on colonization. And that means that people from one part of the world came here and took this land at the expense of the people that lived here on this part of the world. Now, some argue that, hey, look, some of our colonies that were formed, you know, the indigenous people here didn't necessarily have laws. There was not a clearly defined borders and states with flags, and so on. Well, aside from even dealing with that argument, eventually treaties were made that were supposed to allow for rights to the people who were originally here. And our own government broke our own laws to get more land and take it from other people. With Andrew Jackson, we see that a legacy really loud and clear. Now, here's what's interesting, though. It was Christian missionaries that actually brought a case before the Supreme Court arguing that the Cherokees had a right to keep their land and stay on their land. And then basically Jackson said, the result of the Supreme Court is irrelevant to me. And this then leads me to kind of want to point out something. We as Americans, those of us with all of our political differences that we have, in a sense could argue that we're all conservatives. We can all trace our political positions, our values about human rights, laws, ethics, what we should be able to keep or not keep, the role of the state. All of these things we can find a legacy and founding fathers and presidents and other political leaders, people on the ground that would represent our points of view. There's not one thing that I can think of that's talked about now in American politics that doesn't have itself rooted in something based on our very relatively recent history. Now, I think that what we need to remember, I mean, it's good to ponder. You know, the Boston Tea Party, people dressed up in costume and they destroyed private property to make a political point of view. What's the difference between an anarchist throwing a brick at a bank window? I mean, I'm not actually making a justification for anything. What I'm trying to say is that it's just interesting how we in the United States have not resolved what we think is a proper way to react to things. And what we find is that we're rather appalled by certain political actions or we're not. But again, they all come back to our own legacy. What I'm seeing right now in the United States with the way that Americans are so polarized, I think that what we should just remind ourselves is, since we all do represent different aspects of our legacy, not calling each other's Americanism into question, but question what part of the American legacy do we really want to represent. And I think it's really important that we remember that at one point we did have a civil war where over 500,000 of us died to get our point across and for things to change. And that the implications of that and what happened there are still not resolved. I don't think we want to go that route again. And I think it would be really good for us to reflect as we celebrate this idea of being independent this July 4th, of what makes us a better place. Because right now we're judging each other, but history will also judge us. And we hope for the better.